This is Billy Kay, welcoming you to A History of Scottish Literature, Programme 4, Wizards of the North.
In a sense, Scotland, from Burns to Scott, created the conditions for the development of some of the major literary genres of the 19th century throughout the world. And that, in a sense, defined for many people outside Scotland what Scotland was about, that literature was our great national achievement.
When you're looking at the reputations of literary people in the 19th century, the people anyone in Europe would have been talking about would have been Scott and Byron. Nobody wanted to know about Wordsworth and Keats.
One young man travelling on the continent, for example, wrote back to his aunt to say, "I've been getting on marvellously here because I say that I'm Scottish," and everyone just jumps up and talks about Walter Scott.
Alison Duncan, Rory Watson and Cairns Craig on the period of Enlightenment and Romanticism, when Scottish writing was revered around the world, with Sir Walter Scott, the Wizard of the North, very much in the vanguard with the Waverley novels. But it was his epic poetry which first took Europe by storm. Douglas Gifford of Glasgow University.
The Lay of the Last Minstrel in 1802, The Lady of the Lake in 1805, and Marmion. And the one for me that is so neglected, The Lord of the Isles. Magnificent, big, sweeping, cinematic survey that ends in Bannockburn. And that is all happening at the beginning of the 19th century and tapping into this rediscovery. So you've got the philosophical input and you've got this result of the Act of Union, which is the reawakening of Scotland as a cultural centre. If not a political centre, they're trying to make it an Athens of the North. Even in novels like The Talisman, he understands exactly that the Crusaders are psychopaths and that Saladin is the hero of The Talisman. So that bigness of vision came from the Scottish Enlightenment.
It's easy to see very strong links with the Enlightenment in Romanticism, and you can see that particularly in Scotland, where a lot of the values of the Enlightenment writers, particularly the values of sentiment and feeling, are key to Romantic writing, and where Romantic writing defines itself as national.
Do you feel as if you belong to a tradition in Scottish literature?
Yes, I do. It's a tradition I only discovered at school. The only Scottish novel we were given was Ivanhoe, by Walter Scott, certainly. It's not one of his best novels. It's a story that explains how the English people became one nation, how the upper-class French eventually identified with the Anglo-Saxon English, and how they become one nation. What a great lesson for a Scots child to be taught at school. Why didn't they give us Heart of Midlothian or Old Mortality? One of his greatest books, you see, there you have Scots talking with a Scottish dialect. That was one reason why we had very little of Burns at our school.
Alastair Gray, whose novel Lanark was groundbreaking in 1981, as Scott's Waverley novels were seminal after 1814. Alan Reich of Glasgow, Alison Lumsden of Aberdeen, and Penny Fielding of Edinburgh University.
Scott was the most significant writer, really, in the whole of that period, and the most popular novelist in Europe. He really invented a whole new genre, the historical novel. There were other models, particularly the Irish novelist Maria Edgeworth, whom Scott acknowledged, but he did more than anybody else to create this whole way of looking about human history, how history and geography fit together. There'd be no War and Peace if there was no Walter Scott.
Father of the psychological novel, because in Waverley he is studying the dangerously romantic imagination of a young Englishman who comes into Scotland. As Waverley goes into the Highlands, for example, you see his mind going awry because he's seduced by the sheer difference of this landscape that's nothing like anything else in England. What Scott points out to us all through the novel is Waverley is in a dangerous dream.
Both Scott and Byron both have the ability to move through landscape, perceiving it in a creative way and describing that landscape through the processes of memory and imagination.
Scots, Edinburgh is a brooding presence in the heart of Midlothian. In Old Mortality, the Lanarkshire uplands are a brooding Thomas Hardy-like presence that plays a part in the action. Landscape and symbolism, the heart of Midlothian, which is not just the old heart of Midlothian, the jail, but it's Jeanie Deans, who is the redeeming heart of Midlothian, an earlier version of Chris Guthrie.
Scott is the first really great author to make the main character Jeanie Deans, a common cow feeder's daughter, the person who introduces the role of working class people into the world of fiction and giving them the human dignity that counteracts the station that they've been given by this social order. There's a revolutionary potential in that.
This is Jeanie Deans, played by Gerda Stevenson, and pleading with Queen Caroline to spare the life of her young sister, wrongly condemned for infanticide.
Alas, it is no when we sleep saft and walk merrily o'er cells that we think on other people's suffering. Our hearts are waxed licht within us then, and we are verricht in our ain rangs and fecht in our ain battles. But when the hour o' trouble comes to the mind or to the body, and seldom may it visit your ladyship, and when the hour o' death comes, that comes to high and low, lang may it be yours. Oh, my lady, then it isna what we hae done for ourselves, but what we hae done for others that we think on maist pleasantly. And the thought that ye hae intervened to spare the poor thing's life will be sweeter in that hour, come when it may, than if a word o' your mouth could hind a hale porteous mob at the tail o' ye tow.
The balancing act between restrained sensibility and extravagant romanticism emerged in one of the iconic literary successes of the age, James Macpherson's Fragments of Ancient Poetry, which the author claimed were part of an oral tradition going back to the ancient Celtic bard Ossian. Murray Pittock of Glasgow University.
Here is a European epic that belongs to the north, that belongs to the Celts, that is associated with the voice of the people, and also with being recorded in the present and filtered through Enlightenment sensibility. Because, Macpherson isn't like Quentin Tarantino. You don't get any on-screen violence. Everything happens really off-screen. So it's very decorous, it's very Enlightenment.
There's this idea among the Germans of what they call Die Blaue Ferne, the blue yonder. Yeah. And Scotland seemed to have fitted into this ideal in a way.
Yeah, German Romanticism is increasingly becoming interested in the voice of the people, as Herder would have called it. And also both European and Scottish Romanticism is becoming increasingly interested in associating that with something which would have been called in those days the primitive.
It is perfectly true that there is plenty of nostalgia in Gaelic poetry. There is poetry which looks back to vanished periods, but the sort of pathetic, feeble idea of the desire of the aged bard, oh, stretch me out beside the bank and prop up a lamb underneath my arm and let me weep slowly and silently into the grass as I remember yesteryear, all that sort of stuff. That is, I think, pretty alien to the Gaelic world.
Ossian and a Gaelic perspective from Professor Willie Gillies of Edinburgh University. But the great and good from Thomas Jefferson to Napoleon lapped it up as yet another expression of an appealing zeitgeist with a Caledonian epicentre.
For example, in Germany, Burns fulfills a kind of full-scale wish list in that he's a sign of a progressive, universal, democratic and radical poetry. And he's also, like the Grimm brothers, he's a collector of folk tales and stories and songs and poems. And he's also a writer of them. He actually symbolises a living tradition for many European romantics.
Walter Scott was considerably influenced in his early writings by the German, what they call it, Sturm und Drang movement.
Goetz von Berlichingen. He translated Goetz von Berlichingen.
And yes, and that undoubtedly gave him an idea that if Goethe can write a great play about a German robber baron, why shouldn't I deal with Scotland? My ancestors, after all, were border lairds and, and raiders.
The Lay of the Last Minstrel, The Kerrs versus the Scots, the Cessfords versus the Buccleuchs. Nearly every Scot poem or fiction, it's a clash between past and present. It's the divided self and the divided community and the divided country. Civil war is so often his theme. And how the older enthusiasms of the past, the Jacobites, the Covenanters, Rob Roy, for example, have to accept that things are moving on.
If you're reading, say, Scott in Romania or Poland, you don't know any of this Enlightenment historical modelling that he's doing. You just see the stuff about freedom fighters and struggles and cultural opposition. So Scott can seem a very radical writer to Europeans and a very unionist writer to people in Britain, and in a way they're both right.
Scott had the same duality within him, saying his heart would have been out with bonny Prince Charlie, but his head would have gart him bide at hame with douce Edinburgh lawyers. But for cultured Europeans, Scotland became the must-see travel destination. Jerry Crothers and Kirstine McHugh of Glasgow and Ian Campbell of Edinburgh University.
You know that Thomas Cook, when he started his tours, his first tour was to Scotland, simply because down south a lot of people had heard of Scotland in a real sense for the first time through Sir Walter Scott.
People flocked to Melrose Abbey after they'd read The Lair of the Last Minstrel just to see it by moonlight.
Things like The Lady of the Lake obviously were very resonant, and in some senses those were the things that brought people to Scotland and to develop that whole idea of the picturesque Highlands.
The Burns cottage at Alloway is functioning by the early 19th century. It's got souvenirs being sold by the 1820s and 30s. Often when Mauchlinware souvenirs come in, they're sold in the opposite place to the place where you're visiting, so that if you go to the cottage, you buy monument Mauchlinware, and then you go to the monument and pick up your cottage Mauchlinware to ensure you've done the tour.
It's estimated there are 1 million pieces of Mauchlinware made. So the Burns phenomenon very much drives things in real life.
These attract many, many European visitors. Figures like the Hungarian nationalist Kossuth and Garibaldi, among Italian nationalists, recognises this development in Scottish Romanticism and the memorialisation of the particular achievements of the Romantic writers of Scotland.
You can imagine Mendelssohn and Theodor Fontana and Christian Lachgerma just thinking, I'm here, this is the centre of the Romantic universe.
Yeah, and how Mendelssohn in his letter can't write about that, he can't describe that experience with words. And the opening of the letter says, this is my experience, and he actually gives the first few bars of the overture in his letter. He can't express it in terms of words, he can only express it in this musical idea, which I always think is just the most wonderful thing, you know.
And literature still has a crucial role promoting the country and attracting visitors to it. Ali Bowden, director of the world's first UNESCO City of Literature, Edinburgh.
So Billy, here we are in the Writers' Museum, which is a beautiful wee building just off the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. And it's one of several locations in Edinburgh that are dedicated to celebrating the work of our authors. There are a number of other locations actually nearby. The National Library, which is just a stone's throw away, and they have the fabulous John Murray exhibition. Just a great space to learn more about Edinburgh and Scotland's importance in terms of publishing and sort of literary history and development. And then just a wee jaunt further down the Royal Mile, you'll bump into the John Knox House there, which is nestled up against the Scottish Storytelling Centre. And if you jog a wee bit further down the mile with me, I'll take you to a statue of Robert Ferguson, showing you the way towards the Scottish Poetry Library. And that's the only purpose-built poetry library in the world.
We've also passed by, to the left, the site of one of the few railway stations in the world named after a novel.
I know, and so many people have no idea about that. But it is the only, as far as we know, the only train station in the world named after a series of novels, the Waverley novels. And we've jogged past, of course, the world's tallest monument to a writer. This incredible rocket made of stone sitting on Princes Street there. A really bold statement of how important writers and writing and stories are to Edinburgh. There's a lovely story, though, about the last element of the Scott Monument, because like every public art project, they ran out of money. Of course, that's what you do. But the stonemasons, lovers of Scott, they read Scott because Scott was so widely read. He was the J.K. Rowling of his age. And they completed the last part, which is the very ornate pointed element at the very top, for free, because they wanted to complete it in honour of Scott.
Coming into the Scott room here, there's one or two great quotations that I noticed.
There's one here that's my favourite, and it's from Marmion 1808. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive.
I love this one because it ties in Burns and Scott. Long life to thy fame and peace to thy soul, Robert Burns. When I want to express a sentiment which I feel strongly, I find the phrase in Shakespeare or thee. And this one where he's describing almost what it's like being a writer.
Yes, this is from The Fortunes of Nigel. I think there is a demon who seats himself on the feather of my pen when I begin to write and leads it astray from the purpose. Characters expand under my hand. Incidents are multiplied. The story lingers while the materials increase. My regular mansion turns out a Gothic anomaly.
You will often come across people who say they've read Scott at school, for example. But having looked at children's adaptations of Scott, sometimes I wonder what they've read, because there's a wonderful adaptation of Waverley that reads a bit like Five Go to the Jacobite Rise. It's kind of Purian and blight. But it's saying Walter Scott's Waverley retold for boys and girls, and you think, if that's what people have read, no wonder they've got strange ideas about Scott.
Sticking with the 19th century, I think Hugh McDermott goes a bit far when he claims T.S. Eliot and Herman Melville as Scottish writers because of their names.
It's like Kant's a Scottish philosopher, right?
There's a story there.
I know.
He was a Baltic Scot, going back centuries. But Lord Byron said, I am half a Scot by birth and bred a Holborn, and my heart flies to my head. Can we really claim him?
I'm absolutely in favour of claiming Byron, not just on the basis that we'll take anything we get if it's not nailed down, but because there is a real story to tell. Byron appears to have spoken with a Scottish accent even to adulthood. He was quite proud of being an Aberdeen Grammar School FP, and he supported other Aberdeen Grammar School FPs who were in need into the 1820s. If you look at Byron's network in continental Europe, they're often Scots. So does he think of himself as a Scot? Very significantly, he does.
He very much was aware of that as part of his formation. Obviously, things like Dart Loch Nagar are acknowledging what is, to some extent, a constructed Scottish childhood, but it's clearly an important part of his heritage.
We'll take him, he's ours.
I think we'll have him, yes.
Yeah. He corresponded with Walter Scott. Mm-hmm. And in the letters, Byron emphasises his Scottish connections.
That's right. He's keen to emphasise that he's a kindred spirit to Scott.
Away, ye grey landscapes, ye gardens o' roses, in you let the minions of luxury roam, and restore me the rock where the snowflake reposes, if still they are sacred to freedom and love. Brave Caledonia, dear are thy mountains, round their white summits though elements war, though cataracts roll instead of smooth flowing fountains, I sigh for the valley of Dart Loch Nagar.
George Gordon, Lord Byron's stirring anthem to his Caledonian childhood, Dark Loch Nagar. Individual brilliance apart, another reason for Scottish writing flourishing in the 19th century was a thriving publishing industry.
It is remarkable, for instance, that Nelsons in Edinburgh were producing classics of French literature for sale in France in enormous numbers. And you have lots of publishers producing journals for the mass market, mostly at that time emanating from Dundee. This huge publishing industry gave writers access to a new kind of audience.
It's not London that develops the big new periodicals like the Edinburgh Review, Blackwood's Magazine, with these publishers like Constable, Nelson, Longmans, Oliver and Boyd. Constable especially, because he paid well for really good writers. He attracted people to publishing, and then you get John Galt and you get James Hogg, and we know the rest.
Among those contributing to the publishing boom was a remarkable group of female writers. Mrs. Oliphant's Kirstine, for example, is one of my all-time favourite novels. But sadly, most of these authors await rediscovery, so the Scottish tradition could appear very masculine to writers like Louise Welsh.
It's hard to be part of a mainstream tradition because for me as a young woman growing up, a young reader, there were very, very, very few female role models in terms of literature that you could follow. So I guess we would be looking at a lot of male writers, but not really seeing ourselves. So I don't know if I'm part of a tradition, but I think as a woman writer, it's perhaps doubly difficult to see yourself in that way.
Scott had a lot of respect for his contemporary female Scottish writers, women like Ferrier and the dramatist Joanna Baillie. He wrote to one of them to say that there is a Freemasonry among kindred spirits, and I am your adopted brother. And a lot of these writers named each other in their works. They were signalling their membership of this kind of Freemasonry of literary people.
One of them was well on the way to becoming an international bestseller before Walter Scott, Robert Crawford of St Andrews University and Alison Duncan.
Jane Porter, who became very well known for her novel The Scottish Chiefs, that was republished many times. And in fact, you can also find it in a 1950s American illustrated comic. Although you'll find on the cover of the comic edition, Wallace looks very much like a blonde, brawny Prince Charlie.
She's rather in love with Wallace, I think. And this book goes through about 75 editions. It comes out originally in 1810, so it's before any of Walter Scott's historical fictions. She was born in England, but she had spent part of her childhood in Edinburgh, and she had encountered aspects of what we now call oral tradition. She writes, I was hardly 6 years of age when I first heard the names of William Wallace and Robert Bruce, not from gentlemen and ladies, readers of history, but from the maids in the nursery and the serving man in the kitchen.
I'm very interested in Susan Ferrier, and I'm very interested in Oliphant, who was a professional writer par excellence. 99 titles. She just wrote and wrote. She makes Scott look positively idle by comparison.
A novel like Kirstine's very much part of that tradition of the national tale, which Scott, of course, establishes and contributes greatly to.
He helped Ferrier negotiate a rather large sum for her third novel. Her first novel was Marriage in 1818, and the sum she got for that was about £200, which was similar to what Jane Austen got throughout her career. It would have to be said that Susan Ferrier earned a lot more than Austen, partly because she had Walter Scott to help her negotiate, but also she was of slightly higher rank. Her family was quite simply better connected, so that gave her an entry into a different type of readership.
For her later novels, The Inheritance and Destiny, Ferrier was paid £1,000 and £1,700, just about enough to give a gentlewoman an income for life. Among all the authors was a desire to project pride in Scottish culture to an outside audience, a tradition in the novel going back to Tobias Smollett's pioneering 18th century works, Roderick Random and Humphrey Clinker.
It's as if everyone is so mixed together and so corrupted by fashionable life in England that there's no clear ethics and there's no clear social structure. It's partly to show how Scotland contributes to the Union and how in many ways Scotland is better, more healthy and more ethical place than England.
How important in the development of the novel is Humphrey Clinker?
Pretty important. It's one of the most successful novels in letters. A number of novels were written in letters or in journal form in the 18th century, partly, of course, because of the new readership provided by women.
The nation of Scotland is a community in a way that England or Britain isn't, and that comes through in novels like Susan Ferrier's Marriage, for example, where the Scots are seen as family-oriented, friendly and intimate, and the English families are seen as kind of distant, remote and formal.
In good old times, Scotland had its regular standard measure for visiting: a rest day, a dress day, and a press day. The idea was that on your rest day, you arrived, you relaxed, you chatted. The dress day was for the grand dinner, showing off your jewels and your clothing. And the press day was when you suggested you had to rush off and the host said, no, you must stay. And you argued about it for a little while. And then you stayed and both parties were well satisfied. That was the idea of politeness.
The other great Scottish novelist of the early 19th century was John Galt from Ayrshire, with works such as The Entail, The Provost and Annals of the Parish.
He's a real favourite of mine. He plays games. He imprisons you in the mind of a country minister. This nice man who stays in the same parish and is a nice minister for 50 years. And again, this is a book that's been hugely popular and loved and has been described as Kailyard. But if you read it closely, you will find that virtually every chapter you can see something happening outside the parish that's mentioned. We can see it, even if the man telling the story can't see it. And we can see how the idyll that he wishes Scotland would be, staying the same, never changing. It's just not going to happen. From 1760 to 1810, Europe was in conflagration, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the Industrial Revolution. He's not interested. And sure enough, when he retires, he's loved and white-haired, but his church is emptied.
He describes one of the first drug-taking sessions in Scottish literature, where the ladies of the parish are consuming an illicit brew-up of tea in the country, away from prying eyes.
Because tea was heavily customs taxed. But then Mr. Balwhidder, who doesn't realise how open he is actually got a soft spot for one of those ladies. So he puts up with it for their sake.
In the next programme, Twa Corbies and Tartan Noir, I'll be exploring the dark side of our literature, dire crimes, the deal, the gothic, the supernatural, along with the author of The Cutting Room, Louise Welsh. This is how she was drawn to the flame.
The book that I first remember feeling that about is Treasure Island. And I remember that being read to me by my dad and being excited, really excited by the story. And I guess style and location and characterisation, all of that is hugely important, and that's part of what made the story exciting. But really, I wanted to find out what happened next with the black spot. I was very, very excited.